we happened to be at my husband's family in the Midwest with his mother at Christmas with my little kids, and there was a blizzard, like there always is in North Dakota in December. And we were stuck inside for days, and my poor mother-in-law was going crazy with these little boys running around. And she pulled a book off the shelf that she had never looked at herself. It was a compilation. It was like the 100th anniversary of her small hometown of Jamestown, North Dakota, filled with newspaper articles. And she started leafing through them with Hayden, my oldest kid, who was, I think, 8 at the time. And she was reading the headlines, and there was one article called, they called it Orphan Train, and it proved to be a home for many children on the prairie. It was this ridiculous title. And she started looking at the article and realized, to her shock, that there was a photograph of her father in the article. So her father had been an orphan train rider. He had never mentioned it. Everyone was long dead, her mother, her father, anybody who really would have known. And so all we had was this article to start with. And then a friend of hers did some genealogical research, but my husband had never heard of orphan trains. My mother-in-law had never heard of it. I quickly learned that 250,000 children were sent on these trains in real life from the East Coast to the Midwest, and that there are now more than 4 million descendants of these people, and that it was a labor program, and that they were sent from the ages of 2 to 14, and they were essentially indentured servants, slaves almost, really, to a lot of people. So this was a crazy story. As it turned out, it was hidden in plain sight. Other people had written about it, mostly like self-published, whatever, stories about their parents or grandparents. And but I had never written really about the past, and I had always thought it was stupid. I didn't even read historical fiction. It just seemed dumb. Like, why would I not read something by someone then? Why would I read something by someone now pretending to be then? I didn't really see the appeal of it. And also it felt like, how would I ever approximate that world? It's not my world. So I was terrified, but it was such a big story. I knew it was a big story. So I grounded it in this contemporary story. And when you read the book, you realize actually 2/3 of it is set in the present day and 1/3 is set in the past. But people come away thinking it's a story set in the past completely. Because I think that orphan train story is just so big, right? But that was how it happened. And my mother was a state legislator in Maine, and she was working on Native American rights with a Native American, another legislator named Donna Loring, brilliant woman. And my mother just sent me all this stuff about it all the time. And I had grown up next to Indian Island, which is where my character of Molly is born and raised. And so I wrote about a half Native character who is in foster care and has to make her own way, and the connection between her and this old woman who has ridden on an orphan train. And, when I handed the book in, my publisher was sort of like, I remember a marketing person, I mean, they liked the book, but I remember a marketing person saying, you have this like disaffected 17-year-old goth and this 91-year-old senior citizen. There's not really a reading audience here. I'm not sure how we're going to market this to your core audience of like 35-year-old women is what it was at the time, they said. And of course, the fact that it wasn't about a 35-year-old woman is what probably helped it take off, because it had this sort of universal appeal in some ways. And I think people love uncovering a story, especially Americans, about America. I think people in America like to learn about their history. I had taught in a women's prison, and so a very high proportion of female prisoners have gone through foster care, as you might imagine, just completely torn apart families. So I taught memoir writing in 2 women's prisons, and that had a huge influence on me in terms of creating a world that this girl comes out of. And then I interviewed all kinds of people and foster parents and went down a lot of rabbit holes. And I'm involved in an organization now called Roots and Wings, which is kind of an amazing concept. They provide support between the ages of 15 and 25, when most foster kids are pretty much abandoned. They help people apply to college, get jobs, do job training, have places to go during break, for example. If you age out at 18 or even 21 and you have nowhere else to go, it's really rough. They help them get apartments. I mean, even sponsoring someone for an apartment doesn't happen if you're a foster kid. So I learned a ton doing that book. But as I told you, I grew up in a working class town, so I knew a lot of people as well who had really rough home lives. And so I kind of drew on all of that in creating this character. There were a couple things about the Scenic Route, which is kind of a long short story, right? Amazon Originals does this beautiful series of stories with all these amazing writers, Margaret Atwood and, Alice Hoffman and all kinds of people. And they came to me with this idea of writing a story. I don't write stories usually. I don't think my imagination is normally that great for it. I like a bigger canvas of a novel. And also short stories are really time consuming for me. I mean, some people do it quickly. I do not. So it took a while. But I was intrigued, and you're right, it was after COVID. Also, there were all these influencers posting about their picture perfect lives, doing van life. And so I was intrigued by this whole idea. There had been a cover story in, I think, New York Magazine that was about a woman who did it and kind of discovered all the pitfalls of van life. She was trying to approximate the influencer version, and she, soon discovered that it wasn't all as beautiful as it looks. I was fascinated by that whole world. So I went down, oh my God, I was on Reddit forums. I was on YouTube looking at behind the scenes stories of van life. Three of my friends have vans. And so I was able to kind of see that world and what they live like. I also have 3 boys, and I'd never really written about that. And I was thrilled to write a contemporary story. So I wrote about the relationship between a mother and her son who've been estranged. And I wrote about what it's really like to live in that kind of situation. And I had this breakthrough moment when the idea was percolating. I was on the side of a mountain in Maine. I was climbing a mountain, and a guy coming down had like pins and, I don't know, like bumper stickers on his backpack that said something that were about like #van life. And then one of them said, "See you down the road," which is a phrase I learned that they say to each other when they leave. And one of them said something like, "See you at the next convergence." And I said, do you mind my asking, what is a convergence? And he said, "Oh my God." So this became the pivotal organizing central sort of place in the story for me. Convergences are where van lifers come together. The notice is put out that there'll be a convergence in May in Butte, whatever, and everybody just shows up there. And usually there's an organizer, and oftentimes people come together with food, but it's just a way for these people who are quite solitary in their living, and some are living very much on the edge, and some have more cushy environments, to come together and have this sort of convergence. It's almost a cult-like idea. And so I loved the concept of coming and going from people in that way. And that story was just such a joy in the middle of writing a very complicated novel set in the past that I'm finishing right now. To have that story was a great gift. The Scenic Route is out. I think you may know that. It was like their featured story for the summer, and it's free if you're an Amazon member, or it's like 99 cents, I think. Anyway, the story, and it's audio too, audiobook. The book I'm writing now is based on a family story, a very crazy family story. My mother's great aunts were 2 sisters in Civil War era North Carolina who married 2 brothers who happened to be sideshow freaks, as they were called then, in a traveling circus. Their names are Chang and Eng Bunker. They were the original Siamese twins. And my novel is called The Foursome, and it is the story from the perspective of one of the sisters, the sister who was coerced in the shy sister who was coerced into marrying the awkward brother. And the two beautiful people, the brother and her sister, are the ones who they had to make it happen because they couldn't get married unless the other two got married. So that's all true. They had 21 children. One had 10, one had 11, and they lived on adjoining hillsides. So the men went back and forth every 3 days between the two houses. So it's a fascinating story, but it's also filled with all kinds of pitfalls and minefields. And I put it aside for 2 years and worked on another book, which I will go back to, which is a really fun book. But I eventually just pulled myself together and said, you have to do this. It's a family story. You have to write the story. And so I'm wading into some difficult territory, but it's race, it's culture, it's ability, it's slavery, it's all of this stuff.